Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio is currently home to 18 operating roller coasters, from the 62-year-old wooden classic Blue Streak to the new, hip, and trend-setting tilt coaster Siren's Curse, which just debuted last season. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a Midwesterner who couldn't name at least one of these rides off the top of their head, whether they're a fan of roller coasters or not. Between viral videos, advertising, and in some cases, deeply unfortunate tragedies spilling out of the park and into the news, America's roller coaster has become a part of the cultural zeitgeist. But far less well known than the rides that have stood the test of time are the roller coasters that, for one reason or another, didn't make the cut. In total, Cedar Point has torn down 17 coasters. This means they've kept only one more than they've demolished. Today, I want to go over a brief history of each of these lost rides, in the order in which they were first built. We'll go over the ride experience and try to piece together the reasons why each of these structures went the way of the dodo. I'm Josef. Today is my 37th birthday. Welcome to the Vertical Drop Viking. First up, we have the Switchback Railway. This was Cedar Point's first roller coaster ever, constructed in 1892, where the Lakeside Pavilion stands today. These primitive 19th century roller coasters featured no brakes, no side friction wheels, no upstop wheels, no under friction pads, and no restraints. None of the safety mechanisms or creature comforts that riders expect on modern roller coasters. It also, perhaps most notably, lacked a mechanical lift hill of any sort, relying instead on good old-fashioned elbow grease to get the ride vehicles back to their boarding positions at the top of either end. This ride featured two stations, 25 feet off the ground, with one on either end of a primitive version of an out-and-back layout. The two airtime-focused half-laps, or legs, of the coaster ran in close parallel to one another, but riders only rode the train for one leg before standing up and cheerfully dismounting the still slightly moving train by means of a careful little hop. The trains had a top speed of about 12 miles per hour. Once the riders had left the train, the waiting attendants would grab it and manually push the train up the hill to the adjacent station to be boarded by the next riders. In this way, a switchback railway was more like two shuttle coasters with their ends glued together than like a full circuit out and back. These coasters were invented by a man named Lamarcus Adna Thompson, and Thompson found great success with these coasters during the last decade of the 19th century and the first century of the 20th. However, rapid new developments in roller coaster technology offered more comfortable, more thrilling, and generally safer rides, and the Switchback Railway fell out of fashion. The original Cedar Point Switchback Railway closed permanently in 1901 and was demolished. The first of the aforementioned technological developments to really catch on was the side friction wheel, invented by Edward Joy Morris in 1894. This led to the next trend in wooden roller coaster design, the side friction coaster. Despite having nothing that would be recognized today as a loop, Cedar Point's first installation of the side friction coaster was called Loop the Loop. This ride was manufactured by Frederick Ingersoll and his company. The Ingersoll Company's internal name for this ride was the three-way figure-eight roller toboggan, and both names are commonly used for this ride online. Loop the Loop opened up in 1902 and operated for 7 years before being demolished in 1909. It was 46 feet tall and a little less than a half-mile long. It operated roughly in the place where Windseeker is now, at the north end of the beach boardwalk. Not much else is known about this coaster, but if I had to venture an educated guess as to why it closed, I'm going to point at that 900-degree helix. Ouch. Now, the next roller coaster at Cedar Point was another side friction coaster, but this one was focused on airtime rather than on gut-wrenching laterals. It was called Dip the Dips Scenic Railway. It opened on June 14, 1908, closed on September 19, 1916, and was permanently scrapped in 1917. So it stood for 9 years, just about as long as the last two. Dip the Dips Scenic Railway was 33 feet tall and ran out for 4,200 feet in a double out-and-back layout that featured two lift hills. It operated where Blue Streak is now, but Blue Streak wasn't the next coaster to take its place. It was torn down to make room for number 6 on our list, but we have a couple coasters to go before we get to that. Coasters like Racer, a dual-tracked out-and-back that was built in 1910 by a company called McKay Construction. This one was built literally on the beach, but in spite of that, it lasted twice as long as any of the previous entries on this list, not being torn down until 1928. It was 46 feet tall, the same height as Loop the Loop, which it technically replaced, having been built immediately following that coaster's demolition, despite being positioned out further on the beach than Loop the Loop. I can only imagine how cool it would have been to race your friends on a roller coaster that's physically on the beach in the 1910s. And just imagine how much cleaner the shores of Lake Erie would have been before the automotive boom changed the Midwest forever. Now, back on the other side of the park, near the point where Dip the Dips was operating, a similarly named ride was built in 1912 by the T.M. Horton Company. Since people in 1912 didn't know about search engine optimization, we'll have to forgive them for naming it Leap the Dips, a name it shares with the most well-known and long-standing side friction coaster in the world today at Lakemont Park in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Now, because of this, finding information on the actual Cedar Point ride that isn't just bleeding over from the plethora of information about the Pennsylvania coaster is very, very difficult. On top of that, it makes this video about both coasters a lot more confusing. Leap the Dips was damaged in 1919 and rebuilt in 1920, with the layout being, quote, considerably changed in the process. It's unclear if the double down element was part of the original construction or the rebuilt construction, because again, it's nearly impossible to find any pictures of this roller coaster in the sea of pictures from Pennsylvania. I'm honestly lucky I was able to find out that it had a double down drop at all. The demolition of Dip the Dips, not Leap the Dips, but Dip the Dips, led the park to build a bigger, better version called the Leapfrog Railway on July 1st, 1917. This coaster was 75 feet tall, quite impressive for the time, and operated until its renovation in 1933. The original coaster was built by the Lake Erie Construction Company, and the renovation was done by Andy Vettel. After the renovation, it was renamed to High Frolics, which operated until September 4th, 1939. The ride took up the same plot of land as Dip the Dips, but rather than being a side friction coaster like all those built since 1900, this was the first one at Cedar Point to feature upstop wheels. Upstop wheels are, of course, the wheels that go on the bottom of a rail and keep the coaster from flying off so that a coaster can get more airtime than a side friction or than a scenic railway. It was demolished in 1940, and Blue Streak now stands where it stood. After Leapfrog Railway opened in 1917, it would be over 9 years until Cedar Point constructed another coaster, as the country decided to focus less on amusement park rides and more on World War I. One way to make it really hard to build roller coasters is to send all the able-bodied men to Europe and put all the able-bodied women into factories building military equipment. The good news is that during this time, everyone learned a valuable lesson about the horrors of war, and Germany agreed to never declare war on the entire world ever again. It wouldn't be until 1929 when Cedar Point finally built Cyclone. This was a direct replacement for Racer, taking up the exact same parcel of beach. It was advertised at the time as Cedar Point's fastest, most intense roller coaster. It had a 76-foot drop and reached speeds of 60 miles per hour, totally unheard of speeds in those days. It was designed by Harry G. Traver and had a twister layout like other popular 1920s coasters with similar names. This is actually a relative latecomer to the party. There were 13 Cyclones built before Cedar Point built Cyclone. Now, unfortunately for everyone alive at the time, the release of Cyclone was followed up almost immediately by the Great Depression. Nobody could afford anything, and that includes Cedar Point affording good ride mechanics. The Cyclone rapidly deteriorated on the beach. The Great Depression ended roughly around the time that everyone forgot that valuable lesson about the horrors of war, and Germany decided to declare war on the entire world again. By the time the country returned to normal in the mid-1940s, Cyclone was an absolute mess on the beach. Cedar Point hired Andy Vettel to renovate this coaster like he did for High Frolics, but by this point it was too little too late. Cyclone had become a turd, and it didn't matter how much Andy Vettel polished that turd. The ride was still rough, and people still didn't want to pay to ride it. Cedar Point put the coaster up for sale in 1950, using Billboard magazine for its originally intended purpose of being an advertising industry trade magazine by putting an ad for sale in the paper. Now, believe it or not, nobody wanted to buy the busted-up pre-war roller coaster, tear it off the beach, schlep it somewhere else, and rebuild it. It was demolished in 1951. The next year, in 1952, Cedar Point decided to take an entirely different approach. They got in contact with a man named Bert Marcy, who owned a traveling kid coaster called Little Dipper. Well, it wasn't traveling yet, but it was about to travel from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, up to Ohio. Rather than pull the trigger on buying one of these experimental new rides themselves, Cedar Point leased Mr. Marcy's for 1 year, shipped it up north, and slapped it in their new Kittyland area. This was a steel coaster, but it predated Arrow's invention of the tubular steel track, instead using side friction between two twisted pieces of flat metal that vaguely resembled a train track. While the ride experience was far from smooth, the coaster didn't go fast enough for that to be a problem, and the ride was a smash hit with kids, keeping the little ones entertained for the entire season. Cedar Point realized that paying somebody else every year for a ride that they wanted to make money on themselves was stupid, and so they gave Bert Marcy his coaster back and bought the exact same thing themselves. Mr. Marcy didn't much feel like shipping the coaster all the way back to Myrtle Beach, so he sold it to a kiddie park in Cleveland, where it still operates today. Cedar Point put their new coaster in the same general area as Little Dipper stood, Kittyland, and named it Super Coaster. Now, there isn't much to say about these little kid rides, but they kept Super Coaster open until 1964, the year the Blue Streak opened. This one was also sold to Volmar Park in Bowling Green, Ohio, where it operated until the 1980s. The ride was sold again to a park even further in the middle of nowhere, central Ohio, called Tuscarora Park, where it actually still operates to this day. So far, this list has 2 roller coasters that you can still ride. Neither one of them is worth the trip. In 1959, Cedar Point opened the first of many Wild Mouse coasters. This one was a hybrid built by B.A. Schiff with wooden track on steel support beams. And it looks like a great ride for what it is. I'm not the biggest fan of Wild Mouse coasters in general, but by all accounts, the ones with wooden track were in a league of their own. And it's a real shame that there aren't any left in the Western Hemisphere for me to experience it myself. Cedar Point's first Wild Mouse coaster opened on May 30th, 1959, and was demolished on September 8th, 1963. Just before its demolition, it was replaced by Scamper, a similar wooden Wild Mouse coaster made by an unknown manufacturer, which opened in 1962. Scamper was built very near to the ride that it was slated to replace, and it operated for 7 years before being sold to Gold Rush Junction and rebuilt in Tennessee. Cedar Point would utilize the space formerly taken up by Wild Mouse and Scamper to significantly expand the Midway. While Scamper would only last for a few years at Gold Rush Junction before being demolished, the rest of Gold Rush Junction would eventually have the good fortune of being bought by Dolly Parton, something I've dreamed about happening to me since I was about 14 or so. Broadway Trip was the next coaster to be erected in Cedar Point. This is one of those weird, semi-portable, semi-enclosed mock rides coasters. This one only operated in Cedar Point for the 1964 season. It stood near the front of the park, where Max Air stands today. It has been to so many other parks since then that it's not really worth listing them, but it ended its operating life with a 17-year run at Casino Pier in New Jersey, after having undergone several rethemings in the meantime. Now, these coasters are janky and don't really do anything pleasant, so I'm not sad to hear that it's gone. I rode something similar to this at like a traveling fair when I was little, and when I finally got on Blue Streak at 11 years old, I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that roller coasters don't have to suck. Cedar Point bought their first Schwarzkopf Wildcat in 1970, and it acted as a pleasant mid-level coaster on the Beach Midway for 8 years. This is the first entry on the list that is contemporary with Blue Streak. We are entering more recent history here, folks. My parents were alive and everything. In 1978, Cedar Point famously purchased all the assets of Valley Fair and created the Cedar Fair Corporation, which was a powerhouse in the industry right up until 2024, when they merged with their primary competitor and became Six Flags. Perhaps as a peace offering, the Wildcat was packed up and shipped to Shakopee, Minnesota to be installed at Valley Fair, leaving a Wildcat-sized hole in Cedar Point's coaster lineup that would take a truly creative solution to fill. More on that for number 15, but first, let's cover Jumbo Jet. This is another Schwarzkopf coaster, but unlike Wildcat, this one was a powered coaster with a spiral lift hill. Now, interestingly, the motor only ran on that spiral lift hill, with the lift hill featuring an electrified third rail like the live rail on a subway train. Jumbo Jet was placed in the same location that used to be home to Racer and Cyclone, on the beach. Also like Cyclone, this coaster was built to be the fastest in the park at the time of its opening. Now, like most Schwarzkopfs of the time, this coaster's main goal was to keep you compressed into your seat under 2 to 3 times your own weight for as long as it could, as you careened rapidly through sustained, sharply banked turns. Now, unfortunately, this model, the Jetstar 3, was not particularly reliable, and this one specifically gave the park a lot of mechanical problems. Cedar Point sold it in 1978 to Palace Playland in Maine, which was only the first of 5 relocations this ride would undergo. The following year, 1979, Cedar Point finally came up with the perfect idea of what to build in the Wildcat-sized hole in their coaster lineup that I mentioned before. Their solution was a Schwarzkopf Wildcat. This one was essentially the same as the 1970 edition, but it was newer and fresher with a few updated elements. It initially went in the spot where Jumbo Jet was, on the side of the beach near the Space Spiral, but it was moved in 1984 to make room for the next entry on this list. That makes it the only coaster to ever be moved around within Cedar Point when it was moved to the current location of Siren's Curse, where it remained until 2012. That's right, this is the first coaster on this list I've actually been alive to ride. I rode this with my dad in 2001. When I went back in 2010, it was still there, but I was a young adult who had yet to have kids of my own, and the park was nearly empty. I completely ignored Wildcat. I got my first ride on Millennium Force, and I marathon Top Thrill Dragster for several hours. But if I had known that Wildcat was going away forever the following year, I think I would have given it one last go for old time's sake. Ah well, maybe the next entry will cheer me up. Well, so much for that. Avalanche Run was an Intamin bobsled coaster that sat on the beach in the approximate location of the old Cyclone, old Racer, and old Jumbo Jet coasters. It opened on July 1st, 1985. A couple of months later than its originally advertised opening date of May 11th. Avalanche Run was divisive, with some enjoying the experience of surging through a tunnel, and others saying it's boring, it's not a coaster, there's no airtime, etc. The ride also infamously had to shut down for hours after a rainstorm, as the water would pool on the track and slow the bobsled down considerably. The ride also faced similar problems with the sand blowing in from the adjacent beach. And while these problems are undeniably real bugbears, and admittedly there is no airtime on this bobsled ride, it still was a thrilling ride, and it felt considerably less safe than riding on rails. I didn't find anything boring about it whatsoever. That said, I was born about 8 months before this ride was completely renovated. The bobsled track stayed exactly the same, but it was enclosed by iTech Entertainment, a new dark rides producer from Florida, and given a new space theme, Cedar Point's sort of version of a story and interactive queue. Renamed Disaster Transport, the ride was awesome in the dark, and the air-conditioned queue provided a welcome reprieve from the oppressive humidity and glaring sun of a Midwestern summer. I loved Disaster Transport. This was one of my favorites on my first visit when I was 11, and we kept going back on my second visit when I was an adult just to beat the heat. Now, tragically, the dark ride enclosure was not watertight, which means that the park's plan to beat Avalanche Run's hydrophobia was a failure. The theming elements slowly broke down, and Cedar Point did absolutely nothing to fix them, meaning that by my 2010 visit, the interactive queue was a quiet, air-conditioned queue. But this is still a cult classic, hated by many, but absolutely adored by a few, all the way up until its demolition in 2012. The station for Gatekeeper now stands in its place. Wicked Twister is the final coaster on our list, and this one's a simple tale. Intamin struck gold in the early 2000s when their Impulse coaster model, which was introduced in 1998, suddenly skyrocketed in popularity. The coaster was an inverted, multi-launch shuttle coaster with vertical spikes on either end, like a miniature version of the giant inverted boomerang from Vekoma, without the Cobra roll or vertical loop in the middle. These coasters were ridiculously cheap for an Intamin roller coaster, and could be constructed virtually anywhere that a flat ride could, meaning parks could pick them up with a small financial investment and a small geographical one as well. Six Flags bought 3 of these in 2 years, establishing them as the trendy coaster model of 2000 and 2001, and Cedar Fair followed suit shortly thereafter, buying one for Valley Fair and one for Cedar Point. Cedar Point's installation, the Wicked Twister, sported 2 215-foot twisted vertical spikes and rapidly reached speeds of 72 miles an hour, making it the largest and fastest impulse coaster built at the time, and it held that record until legendary Twin Dragon opened in China in 2021. It was also the only impulse coaster to have both of its spikes twist until that coaster was built, whereas the other impulse coasters have one or both straight spikes. This ride was situated northwest of Disaster Transport, and subsequently the Gatekeeper Station, on a parcel of beach that traditionally was not part of the park itself. It was built even further out on the beach than Racer was, all those decades ago. Its ride cycle was as follows: launch forward, launch back, forward, back, forward, and then rock back and forth slowly to the station while the brakes activated. This is Cedar Point's first launch coaster, and it would lay the groundwork for both Top Thrill and Maverick. The ride's short duration meant that it performed many hundreds of ride cycles per day, undergoing more wear and tear over the course of a given operating day than any other roller coaster in the park. The LIM motors in the ride were also expensive to operate, taking up a bonkers amount of electricity with each launch compared to the newer, more efficient LSM technology that the park introduced with Maverick in 2007. In spite of its quick ride cycle, the ride still faced the capacity issues inherent to all shuttle coasters. There's only room on the track for one train. This means that the coaster was as cheap as a flat ride and only took up as much room as a flat ride, but it coincidentally gave the same rider throughput as a flat ride. Who could have guessed? As the years went on and the ride cycle number ticked up higher and higher with each passing day, the park began to have trouble keeping the ride operating properly. The LIM system was unreliable and it wasn't getting any newer. The park announced its impending closure on August 6, 2021, and it gave its final ride 1 month later on September 6th. According to the ride's turnstile, the coaster had accommodated over 16 million riders in its 19-year lifespan. Out of all the coasters in the park, Wicked Twister held on to its records the longest, not being beat by another impulse coaster until the same year it closed. That concludes our dive into the lost coasters of Cedar Point. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. If you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up to let me know that I'm not wasting my life making videos for nobody. If you're older than Disaster Transport, leave a comment down below and let me know which of these coasters you've ridden and how you felt about them. If you're younger than Disaster Transport, comment and tell me which coaster you would have liked to ride the most. I promise I'll reply to each and every comment. Share this video with your favorite coaster nerd or beard appreciator, and finally make sure you subscribe so that I can invade your front page with new videos every week. I have been Josef, Vertical Drop Viking out.